I took Christmas off to celebrate with my family. After that, it was time to fix 8x16 pixel sprites. I found a scan line to log. It'd take more logging than that to puzzle out what was going on. I needed to rewrite a small piece of code that transforms an 8x16 to the 2 characters that make it up. That's better. Now to cut out the logging so I could try Haunted. This already looked a lot better. I saw a wrong backdrop during blank screens, which I fixed. I started on CNROM, one of the earliest and simplest mappers. CNROM doesn't switch the program at all. It only switches among 2 or 4 banks of characters. I made sure to wrap around instead of reading past the end of ROM. Just as BNROM switches the whole program space on any write, CNROM switches the whole character space on any write. This meant the code would look similar. I searched NestDev Compo archives for a homebrew CNROM game to test. I ended up on the Alfonso game. I ran it in a good emulator to see when it should be switching, and the switching was very subtle. Maybe Jam and Honey would switch more obviously. You might know UNROM from Contra. It has character RAM, fixes the top 16K, and switches the next 16K. Like CNROM and BNROM, it's made of 7400 series discrete logic gates. A variant used only for Crazy Climber fixes the bottom 16K and switches the top half. The reason for that might become clear once I add sampled sound. I fleshed out my program ROM convenience functions. If 240p test suite works, UNROM should be working. Uh-oh, it appeared to be rendering sprites even if they're disabled. I fixed up the check for background disabling and copied it to the object shifters. That looked better. I was able to view several activities. Was the timing already good enough to run my grid floor tech demo? Yes, it was. One complication of adding mappers is finding games to test with. I try to test with games that I'm clearly allowed to show. Usually this means homebrew games, but some mappers are underrepresented in homebrew. I needed a tool to search a folder for ROMs that use a given mapper. In 2013, I wrote a ROM called Holy Mapperal. It detected which of several mappers it was running on and ran tests to make sure that a circuit board was put together right. AOROM is like BNROM except the 2 nametables are separate. It was used for Battletoads and other games by Rare. I based its implementation on BNROM. Next up was Magic Floor, a search game by NoCache. He ported it to several vintage consoles and computers and even a car's backup camera. Then I ported it to Game Boy and overhauled its look with a boulder-shaped teenage girl protagonist named Libbet. Uh-oh, crash. Look at all the diagnostics that sanitizers gave me. It turned out mappers with 32K switching could still have 16K ROM. In Magic Floor, you can roll to the next cell or jump over one cell. You have to land on a cell that's the same shade or the next brighter shade. When you change shades, you leave a track in that direction. Dead-end cells have a hole leading back to the starting cell. Find all possible tracks to win. I needed to look for more games. Before splitting PPU and mapper into separate files, I needed to rename anything mentioning Advent because it was Christmastide by then. It officially became Family Size VM. The first order of business was to put the PPU and mapper into their own source code files. I must have been misunderstanding something about shell variables. If that works, I'll take it. To let routines in different files call each other, I needed to declare their prototypes in an internal API header. I decided to use the Mozilla public license, same as MGBA. I cleaned up and documented the API for nametable arrangement, an API to have the CPU run the PPU for 3 dots, an API to have the CPU read and write PPU registers. An include guard ensures a header gets processed once, even if intermediate headers include it more than once. This prevents duplicate definitions. I made the changes so far compile. I moved mappers to their own file and added a function to find the right mapper and initialize it. Checked my work and added PPU and mappers to the list of source code files. Some mappers need to observe when the CPU or PPU reads memory, not only writes, but it's sort of similar to observing writes. Any mapper that doesn't observe reads gets a null pointer there. I began to split the file into sections by mapper, including mappers I hadn't done but would need to finish by Epiphany. I wrote out the register map for MMC1, which was Nintendo's first integrated memory management controller. About 1/3 of licensed games used MMC1. MMC1 is unusual in that the program writes values a bit at a time, like how the controller is read. It saved 3 pins on the chip. This inconvenience enabled ruthless cost cutting for a children's toy. Sketched out the skeleton of the MMC1's routines. A few later games had a bigger program than MMC1 originally supported. They repurposed one of the character ROM bank bits to switch the program ROM bank. I anticipated some of the pathology that could arise when the PPU makes the mapper switch banks out from under the CPU. I went to the wiki to remind myself how MMC1 works. Programs write a value through MMC1's 5-bit shift register, and then the value in the shift register gets copied to a bank register. They need to reset the shift register at the start. When MMC1 is reset, it ignores further writes until the next read. Bill and Ted relies on this. With reset out of the way, I could get to the actual shifting. Once all 5 bits are written, the MMC1 uses the last writes address to choose the target register. The character bank normally affects only graphics, unless it's a game with oversized ROM like Dragon Warrior 4 or a game with oversized RAM like Nobunaga's Ambition. Making it compile involved reorganizing the convenience functions. I knew I'd need the variables later, just not in the do-nothing placeholder before large ROM support. It compiled. I left testing for the next day. A lot of liturgical seasons end in tide. Christmastide, Epiphany-tide, and Eastertide. They're not directly connected with the brand of laundry detergent. I added logging to the MMC1. I factored out whether to use special behavior for oversized program ROM. I used mode values from the Action 53 mapper. This was on purpose, as MMC1 was a big inspiration for the capability of Action 53, though I did get rid of the shift register in favor of seek and read for compatibility with discrete mappers. I listed behaviors that the emulator might not need for the first try, some of them involving observing the character bank. I decided to implement oversized program ROM anyway. I needed a new convenience functions for 4KB character banks. And then I wrote character bank switching around that. I made all the new code compile. The MMC1 version of 240p test suite gave a blank screen. I switched back to the headless front end for the moment. MMC1 reset was broken. I compared the first few instructions against a good emulator. It would take more logging to fix this one. Why did I AND it with a character mode mask and compare it to program modes? With that fixed, I switched back to the SDL front end. That got 240p test suite for MMC1 working. Then I tried Holy Mackerel. What does error 0100 mean? It can't even tell it's MMC1 because name table arrangement is wrong. That's better. I tried Holy Mackerel in different ROM sizes. It was close enough for me to strip out program-related logging. I knew the SRAM disable bit was wrong. Very few games rely on it. There were still problems with character bank switching, so why did I get distracted into building the MMC3 skeleton? I decided that some structs aren't allowed to contain pointers. Storing pointers makes it harder to build safe states or rewinding. They can, however, hold offsets into some array provided separately. What's this? A tool to find ROMs by mapper? I wonder what MMC1 stuff I'll dig up. I won't be able to run the rainbow mapper, but I can still draw a rainbow with the MMC1. Say hello to Suki, a mermaid who lives on land. I needed to decide the scope of family-size VM. Other emulators already operated in the niche of pedantic accuracy, emulating as many obscure behavior quirks as possible to make sure that poorly behaved software fails exactly the same way it fails on hardware. I didn't feel a need to chase that. Instead, I could run well-behaved software efficiently and indicate where software isn't well-behaved. This resembles the exceptions feature of the Game Boy emulator BGB, which sets a breakpoint when a program does something it shouldn't. If I couldn't support everything, I could at least warn the user when something is suspicious. I needed a way to represent which exceptions have happened. I looked to the Motorola 68000 for inspiration, but only 2 of its exceptions were relevant to the NES environment: bus error for unmapped memory and unknown instruction. The rest look more specific to a Macintosh, Amiga, or Genesis. I saved 68000's numbers elsewhere. I still had to come up with my own exception numbers for the NES. I decided on unofficial instruction, decimal mode, mistimed read or write in VRAM, OAM, or the palette, and reading the controller during sample DMA. I looked at what exceptions BGB has. This is the second time we've seen Magic Floor, but that's not important right now. I'm looking for exceptions. A lot of these don't closely apply to NES either. Meson also has exceptions in its debugger. Of these, I added the break instruction, AOROM, negative vertical background scrolling, and setting the PPU to digital output mode. I put reading uninitialized memory on the back burner because I'd need to keep a code and data log, or CDL. I had it remember what exceptions have been encountered and clear that when starting the machine. I added logging an unknown memory address to each mapper. I made a convenience function for the most common range so that I could use as a read function in the mapper vtable. I added it to existing write functions. And I thought of another exception for oversized MMC1 pathology. I plugged the other exceptions in where they go and made all the changes compile. It's a double header! I documented the store preprocessor's criteria. I rearranged some of the unofficial opcodes to let me log them. I looked for the break instructions so I could log that too, along with some PPU writes, digital output, and negative scroll. During a double header, I often need to take a couple minutes break. To display exceptions, I needed names for the exceptions. C doesn't come with associative arrays, but it has the next best thing, setting only a handful of string pointers in an array. I needed a way to show an exception only the first time it happens. I pasted my first draft into the headless front end. I realized I needed to separate table indices from bit masks, which are 2 to the power of the index. Testing one of my test ROMs. I didn't realize the Action 53 mapper test was that messy. We didn't have Meson back in 2012. I added exception printing to the SDL front end. From here on out, I could compile both SDL and headless front ends. NROM template accesses unmapped memory? That's strange. Oh, there it is, one of my debug checkpoints. How messy is Haunted? I'm almost afraid to look. I see a stray access and a negative scroll. That negative scroll might be a false alarm. It was. I blocked negative scroll on pre-render. Just to reiterate, family size VM isn't meant for testing software under development. It's meant for running software that's already tested. Though now that MMC1 is in, I can run Blarg's test ROMs.